about Colombia, which is the third most populous country in Latin America and the Caribbean. It is a country that has been in a conflict with the current set of actors since 1964. Some would put it even as far back as 1948. Since 1964, more than 220,000 people, the vast majority of them civilians, have been killed by this conflict. Now, the good news is that the largest of the existing guerrilla groups may in fact cease to exist as an armed actor sometime in the next 12 months or so. Peace talks with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, are not quite in their final stages, but out of 5 agenda items, they have agreement on 3, and they're negotiating the last 2 simultaneously. So sometime in the next year, year and a half, 2 years, we're looking at the possible demobilization of about 8,000 fighters who are members of the FARC, and perhaps triple that in support personnel. That's going to pose for Colombia an enormous challenge of what the term of art is DDR, demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration of ex-combatants. I'm looking at the second D tonight, disarmament, and how that might work, and what are the challenges going to be. They're going to be big. The FARC have a lot of weapons. We don't know how many. Maybe even the FARC doesn't know how many. But they are likely buried or otherwise stored in caches, buried in jungle, remote locations all over a country the size of Texas and California combined. We know that the FARC's weapons of choice have been rifles, the AK-47 and its variants like the AKM and the AK-103. We've seen large arms deals. They've mostly gotten their arms through black market third-party dealers. There was a big deal that was revealed to the world in 1999. They got 10,000 AKMs from Jordan through a Lebanese arms dealer involving the Peruvian intelligence chief, the Russian military attaché in Lima, Peru. All these people were involved in, and that's pretty typical of a lot of the arms deals that we've seen getting weapons to the FARC. The FARC rely heavily on homemade explosives, landmines of their own making, IEDs, gas cylinder mortars. They basically take those big propane tanks that you have in your gas grill and pack it with shrapnel and launch it into populations. A lot of grenades and grenade launchers. They're not believed to have functioning manpads, but certainly they've had a few over the years. There's a video you can see on YouTube of a couple FARC fighters taking aim at a helicopter with one and missing. But if they do have them, they've never used them, and probably in the humid jungle conditions, they don't work anymore. In the past, the Colombian military has found weird things. Bits of depleted uranium once some anti-tank rockets that were Swedish in manufacture, but ended up, they were sold to Venezuela, somehow ended up under FARC control. But there's a lot to keep track of, and nobody really knows how big the arsenal is. Now, past disarmaments in Latin America following peace processes have had a pretty mixed record. In El Salvador, the FMLN guerrillas who negotiated peace in 1992 certainly held some of their weapons back from the view of the international verifiers. There was a UN mission, whose part of whose mission was to verify disarmament. And many of those weapons ended up in the black market in and around Central America. Some of them certainly found their way to Colombia, where there are several. The FARC is one of several groups, by far the largest, but one of several. Nicaragua, after its war, the Contra guerrilla group that the United States aided went away, and the military itself shrank from about 90,000 to 15,000 members, and that flooded the area with weapons. There was a point in the mid-90s where you could go to a rural market in Honduras or Nicaragua and get an AK-47 for less than $100. A lot of those also found their way to Colombia. Now, Nicaragua's Sandinista, the Sandinista army, the Soviet Union gave them SA-7 manpads, which, as far as we know, have not proliferated. They still march them out in military parades in Managua. Colombia in the mid-2000s had a disarmament process with a whole network of paramilitary groups that called themselves pro-government, drug-funded groups that called themselves the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia. 32,000 members of this AUC group between 2003 and 2006 at big photo op sort of ceremonies handed in about 18,000 weapons. Those were mostly melted down by December of 2007. A Colombian think tank called the Ideas for Peace Foundation looked at about half of the sample in 2009. They found there were about 71% rifles, 15% pistols, only about 2% machine guns, 2% like rusty old shotguns. The rifles of choice for them too were AKs and AKMs. The largest producers were Bulgaria, the United States, Russia, North Korea, and Belgium. And Israeli arms dealers seem to have played a big role, third-party black market guys, in getting weapons to the old AUC. Now, the FARC, when it disarms, won't be like the old paramilitaries. There's not going to be a series of photo ops of guerrillas handing weapons to some state official or some UN official. But as for the FARC, that would be considered a symbol of surrender, and these are not surrender negotiations. The FARC have not been defeated on the battlefield. The FARC insists over and over, we will not, don't expect a photo op. We are going to keep our weapons. And they claim that they don't trust the state enough simply to hand them over. That the FARC, in an earlier failed peace process in the 80s, started a political party that they thought would be their entry into civilian life, only to see almost 3,000 of its members killed. So they're not as trustful that they're, if they hand in their weapons, they're going to be safe. In Spanish, there's two verbs one verb describes what we're going to see, one does not. The verb entregar, which means to deliver, to hand over, ain't going to happen. The FARC and now the government too are starting to use the word dejar, sort of to leave behind, to abandon your weapons, which is not the same as handing them over. And how's that going to work? I mean, how do you actually declare peace but the guerrillas still have a whole bunch of weapons somewhere? A lot of people are citing the model of what happened in Northern Ireland, where decommissioning weapons took at least 7 years. After the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland between the IRA and the UK in 1998, there was an independent international commission on decommissioning made up of Canadian, Finnish, and Finnish military officials and US diplomats who were checking regularly to see how this was progressing. Have they handed in weapons? Have they handed in ammunition? Have we identified and secured the Semtex and things like that? It was 3 years after the Good Friday Agreement before the IRA even agreed on a methodology for how to check up on all this stuff and how to destroy their arsenal. The final official act of decommissioning happened not until September 2005. And you still had splinter groups on both sides that remained out large after that still had weapons. And the last one from them were not decommissioned until 2010. And that's when the International Commission finally disbanded. So we could be looking at a lengthy process in Colombia as well. The experience in Northern Ireland shows that it can be done, but it shows that it really relies on international monitoring that's credible and a lot of international pressure to support. Of course, whether it's a photo op or whether it's this steady trickle of a handoff, only the FARC knows how many arms it actually has. And actually, as I said, maybe they don't even know. We do know that in the case of the Colombian paramilitaries, there was certainly a big disproportion between the number of paramilitary fighters and the number of weapons handed in, 32,000 versus 18,000. So that leads us to suspect that a lot didn't get handed off. There are paramilitary successor groups active in Colombia that have a few thousand members. They're engaged in narco trafficking and other organized crime, and they probably got a lot of their weapons just because they never quite handed them in, and their former mid-level commanders now running these new groups. Colombia's police say they've also got a lot of shipments from China in the past few years. And of course, if the FARC does demobilize, one big issue is landmines. Colombia has more landmine casualties, or they did in 2013, than any other country in the world, because, and those are mainly the work of the guerrillas. Luckily, or in a sign of de-escalation of the conflict, on March 7th, the Colombian government and the FARC reached a landmark agreement to actually start doing landmine removal. And that will start in a few weeks with mixed teams of military and guerrillas, which is interesting since the conflict is officially not over. If this fails, or if we don't get all the weapons, where are the FARC's arms going to end up? There may be members of the FARC who don't agree with the idea of demobilizing and are going to rearm and maybe be involved in criminality. A lot of the weapons could end up with them. You're going to have, in post-conflict Colombia, as you see in Venezuela, in Central America, in Mexico, a big organized crime problem, a lot of lucrative trafficking. Those groups will be very interested in obtaining FARC weapons that still remain. Organized crime elsewhere in the region, like those countries I mentioned, or even Brazil, might be interested in buying some from the Colombian market. Venezuela is one to keep an eye on because there is some real potential for unrest in Venezuela, as we've seen, and should violence break out, in Colombia could be seen as a weapons market. God, I hope that doesn't happen. And of course, there's not just the FARC. If the Colombia's military has to shrink following the peace accord, there is always concern about leakage from military stockpiles as well, although right now they're reasonably well secured. In order to limit this, I think the answer after a peace accord, which again I think could happen as early as the end of the year, the first quarter of 2016, international monitoring of the decommissioning process with at least enough, hopefully more than enough, manpower and budget to really make it happen. And in order to make that happen, Colombia's government has been showing some resistance from sovereignty grounds to having international involvement in the post-conflict. They're going to need it on that and many other fronts. And also, Colombia, which is, again, a large country with a lot of lightly governed areas, is going to have to get a bigger state presence in territories where a lot of weapons castles are likely to be and where there's been a history of armed group dominance, especially in border zones and along the coasts. It's going to be a big challenge, but I do think that the international community can step up and make it happen.